EV charging and the infrastructure that is going to basically kind of change the landscape of America and around the world is really at hand right now as we see more and more EV adoption and manufacturers jumping into the game. My name is Paul Barron. This is TechPath. We're going to jump into it today, really around the networks that are being developed for you if you're an EV owner, or maybe you're looking at adding an EV to your roster or fleet. And you're thinking, well, goodness, I need to deal with the whole range anxiety issue. So what do I do in terms of charging? That's what we're going to try to break down, is kind of where that future is going. Joining me today is Jonathan Levy, who is the Chief Commercial Officer, over at EVgo. Great to have you, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Yeah, let's get into a little bit about EVgo. I mean, there are several, different charging networks out there. Me being a Tesla owner and driver, I only get to use the supercharger, but I've always wanted to know if I can go and charge in other places. I've had a chance to use other chargers with, the J adapter. That's been a fairly decent experience, but not one that has been great. So tell me a little bit about EVgo and how many units you guys have out there in terms of charging stations, kind of your direction that you're currently in.
Sure, happy to. And at EVgo, we've been working at this for about a decade, and so we often say that we're a first mover in EV charging, and in the US, being a first mover means you're a first learner. So we have the largest public fast charging network, more than 800 locations across the country. And when you talk about the experience you've had with the J1772 adapter, I think that starts with the education that we all have to do, because there's three different types of charging. There's level one, which is a trickle charge in your home outlet.
Right.
Level two, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of home charging. And then DC fast charging, which is what we really focus on the public fast charging network. So what we've been doing is trying to really enable electric for all, because what we've seen in the market is as the automakers have brought these longer range, lower cost cars like the Model 3, the Leaf Plus, the Bolt, the Nero, all these great ones that are already on market and coming to market, it's opened the aperture for not just that second vehicle in your garage, but for the apartment dweller, for the fleet, for the rideshare driver. And all of those drivers have different needs, and many of them need to rely on public fast charging. So we try and make it easier for everybody to go electric. And at EVgo, one of the things we've done is integrated Tesla connectors at a number of our stations, starting in San Francisco and LA, but recently expanding across the country. And we're in the process of installing around 600 of those across our network.
Cool. So that's going to be a good thing, I think, just in the sense of being able to kind of get a scenario where you see Teslas charging at these kinds of units. I think that is a big thing, because a lot of people have these misconceptions of where can you charge? Tesla only charges. Can I charge my car over at a Tesla supercharger, which you can't? There's all these variables that kind of flow into someone's decision on if they're going to jump into electric. And the more I talk to people that want to learn about electrification in terms of the automotive side, that's like their number one concern. It's either one, they don't have access to a charger, as you just mentioned, at home, which really kind of pushes them into, the networks and really kind of how that's going. So it definitely has an impact on, I think, the adoption rate. When you look at the proposed $2 to $4 trillion infrastructure bill, when you look at kind of the best practices that are going to be implemented with this new infrastructure, how would this affect your business going forward, and where do you think the trends are going to lean as this infrastructure starts to roll out?
Yeah, great question, Paul. And in fact, we look at policy as a major tailwind for the entire sector. And there have been great tailwinds happening across the policy spectrum at the state and local levels for a long time. There's a great deal of money out there from what's called the Volkswagen Appendix D settlement from Dieselgate, where states have billions of dollars to be able to allocate, up to 15% of which to go to charging infrastructure. And so we've been seeing a lot of those grant and rebate programs coming. The federal government and the work that the Biden administration has put out through the American Jobs Plan is another tailwind. It's something that will help accelerate the market. We already know the shift to electrification is happening. It's happening now. The question is just how much faster it will get. But what we like about what the Biden administration has put out is that of that $174 billion for the EV adoption, it's not all in one pot. At EVgo, we talk a lot about how it's not a chicken and the egg problem with charging in cars. That implies something has to come first. And we already have a base of infrastructure in the US today. And there are already great electric vehicle models available for purchase. What we talk about is peanut butter and jelly. That means you need to complement the charging infrastructure that we've been building ahead of the market with the vehicles to be using it to create a sustainable ecosystem for the whole industry. And what the
Mhm.
American Jobs Plan does is it has both. $15 billion of the 174 is focused on infrastructure, but there's also a great deal on the manufacture of the vehicles in the US. There's a great deal of funding for consumer adoption, consumer incentives. And we think that's really important to get the cars in the hands of those drivers to really be out there using. You don't want to overbuild and you don't want to have too many cars without the infrastructure. So it really is that complementarity. And so this is a little bit of possibly too nerdy on the policy side, but some of my background is I spent a long time in DC, and we look at the aperture of things that could happen out of Congress, and there are things in the tax section. Right? So there's 30C, which is an alternative refueling property tax credit for the chargers themselves, and there's 30D, which is a tax credit for the individual consumer. We think we need to have both of those things be reformed and perhaps make direct payer refundable. Similarly, there are grant and rebate programs under consideration, and it's important to have those for L2s and fast charging, for city
Right.
and corridor, and for a combination of programs, including we think using the Department of Energy State Energy Program to really leverage those existing programs the states are already doing to really be stimulative and get the funds out there to build out.
I think that's, with all of the support, there is a lot. First of all, there's a lot more awareness, I think, from the general community. And in most cases, people who are looking at, and I think Tesla's done a good job at kind of being the poster child for electrification in the automotive side. And it's helped a lot of other individuals kind of take that next step, either one, in at least starting to look into buying an EV or making the commitment and jumping into it. Oh, let's talk about the infrastructure itself, because the more I've talked to different companies like yourself, part of that build out that has been occurring, at least over the past few years, has been mostly, primary trip, scenarios, meaning staying close to highways, dealing with, near and around retail centers, not really in the infrastructure inside cities to where you have kind of the intercommute scenarios coming on. Tesla's been pretty good about that, but theirs to a certain extent is somewhat lacking. I mean, here we are in South Florida. I would argue that we might rival California in terms of population, in terms of sales. I know in Broward County, where I live, it's crazy the number of Teslas are out here, and we still only have a handful of chargers that are available. And it's getting to the point now where if you're charging a Tesla at any kind of flex time, you're getting in and the entire bays are full. So it's showing the stress on the system. So my curious question to you is, how are you guys going to handle that infrastructure change as money comes into the market for you to be able to build out your network? The demand starts to develop more. Are you looking more toward inner city or staying along the thoroughfares?
Yeah, great question, Paul. In the early days, when you think about the way that this market has developed, those first generations of Leafs and i3s were for folks that needed to have that second car, right? And so it was a commute car. So the charging was just for the road trips. It was just for the confidence. What we see now, again, with that shift to longer range, lower cost cars, is it's opened the aperture for everybody. And so we actually have been focusing on and in and around the urban and suburban cores for quite some time now. And so we've been building out in cities, around cities. We think that that's actually core because the average American drives less than 30 miles a day, and they do stay close to home. Most of your trips are going to be around there. So the EVgo philosophy is, how do we integrate charging into your everyday life? So those retail centers are really important because if you're an apartment dweller, if you're like our CEO and you live in an apartment building that has no access to charging, then you're going to be relying on other charging. And so she can know that there's a grocery store trip that she was planning on taking anyway, and she can charge there, and she can make sure that EVgo connector is that source of charging for the week or whatever her driving pattern is. So we really focused on that. When it comes to Florida, Florida is absolutely growing, and Elon and the Tesla crew have done a phenomenal job driving those sales. But the vast majority of both sales and throughput on our network still remain in California. So some of this is about making sure that we are accelerating the market across the country. And that's why when EVgo takes a unit economic lens to where we're building, we do focus again on those urban and suburban cores because that's where the most demand is. But we also work through partnerships. So we've been working with GM to install 2,700 plus new fast chargers across our network over the coming years. Some of that's because we know and they know that you have to have the fast charging out there to help sell these cars But in some of these markets, it's early. So to accelerate that build out, they're helping financially support that. And it really does make a difference in these cities and across the country.
Yeah. I want to go on to this. I have some other questions around, how you're looking at renewable energy, but back to your point there around some of the manufacturers. We've done a review here recently on the Ford F-150 Lightning and just Ford's move toward electrification of their fleet and kind of getting into a position which really I think would be a massive adoption opportunity for EVs in America, at least, especially around the Ford F-150. With that happening, and it seems like more and more manufacturers, they just have not, I don't know that they've completely put the dot to dot here of putting these packages together with companies like you to really come out with a very aggressive program, much like Tesla does, which is, pretty much your first 1,000 miles is free. You get 1,000 miles, and then your person on your referral codes, you can kind of build up as you go. But with some of these makers, they're going into 1, 2, 3-year free charging packages to help roll their vehicles out. Do you see that being an advantage or a deterrent in being able to get the adoption? I just feel like this is something they have to do to be able to keep up with the Joneses.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think first I'd start with the fact that what the F-150 Lightning does is it unlocks the most popular car in America for electrification. And so that changes the game, right? There's a bunch of folks that have been waiting for an electric pickup truck, and that's why there's excitement about Rivian as well as the F-150 and what Chevy and others are bringing to market. But it also opens the aperture to folks that are pickup truck people that never were thinking about an EV, and now they've got something really cool and exciting. We hear from a bunch of our customers that there are different motivations for why they go electric. For a lot of them, it's about the cool factor, the technology. And I think, again, Elon and Tesla did a great job making that one of the primary motivations. For some of them, it's about the environmental bona fides. For some, it's the lower operating cost. And for others, it's just the fact that it's a better way to drive. It's smoother, it's faster, it's quieter. It really is hard to find what I call EV recidivists because it's so much more fun to drive electric than it is to drive ICE. When it comes to the charging itself, what we see is the automakers recognize that some of the most common barriers to purchase, as you've alluded to, are the availability of charging, the range of the vehicle, and the upfront cost. And all of those things are changing and rapidly getting much better with EVgo and others helping lead the way on that. They also know that education is a really big part of that. So we've worked with, for example, Nissan, where if you buy or lease a Leaf or a Leaf Plus, you get that first $250 of charging credit for free, because some of that is about education. Some of it's about the energy itself, but a lot of it is about reminding the customer at point of sale, hey, this is real, this is out there. EVgo has built chargers today and across the country that you can use. And we, the manufacturer, are helping you think about that and take care of that. That gives the customers confidence. We hear a lot from drivers of EVs already that before they had an EV, they had range anxiety. Once they had an EV, they had what we call range confidence, because they know exactly what that car can do, where the nearest chargers are, and what they tend to rely on. One of our colleagues used to joke that it's kind of like your coffee shop. You know where your local coffee shop or coffee shops are. You know where your local charger or chargers are. And then you know if you see that one out in the wild at a new market, you know you can trust it. And that really matters. As an owner and an operator of our public fast charging stations, we're aligned with our customers. If the charger's on and dispensing, that's our revenue opportunity, and that's when we're happiest, as is the customer. That market is different for some of the other competitors out there, which is fine. There's going to be different business models. But ultimately, that reliability and our 98% uptime is really important to consumer confidence. And for those of us that came to EVs from other industries, you kind of assume that reliability is going to be a given. But the fact is, it's still a competitive differentiator. It's something that we're really proud of because we invest in the technology, we invest in preventative and corrective maintenance, and we really are aligned with the customer to give them that first-class experience.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've been, big proponents here on this channel. We kind of, really focus in on EV technology, battery tech, the charging system and networks that are out there, along with the innovation in terms of the technology around automation and autonomy and all those sort of things, which I think is coming to a head. We've seen enough of the awareness factor becoming a big thing. Obviously, SPACs, much like what you guys are involved in, have kind of put forth a lot of these kind of technology companies, because many of them have basically gone public through SPAC offerings. When you look at this, because I see this as phase one was kind of just this generalization of getting the early adopters in, kind of leading what happens a lot around the social effect of any kind of product or service. We're at that phase now, and it looks like we're ready to leap to phase two, which is where I think really people are going to start second guessing and also rethinking their positions with the companies they're working with, meaning the owners. So a Tesla owner is going to start looking at Ford or other scenarios because of the expanded opportunity in networks, all those kinds of other elements. Then you have the whole, Tesla versus whatever scenario. So it kind of creates all that. But one of the things that it starts to bring up is the source for grid. And we've had some stresses on the grid systems just this past year with the issues in Texas and across. Obviously, we're getting ready to go in the summer months. I know California has these rolling brownouts. There's a lot of that scenario that's coming online. How much and how fast are you guys trying to go to renewables in terms of solar or wind or other aspects to be able to get to your systems?
Yeah, great question, Paul. And EVgo was the first North American charging network to go 100% renewables. And that was a decision we took and implemented in 2019, in part because even though our customers know that EVs are cleaner, zero emissions at the tailpipe, and the Union of Concerned Scientists and others have done analysis that even on the dirtiest parts of the grid, EVs are cleaner, people wanted that peace of mind that they were definitely being 100% clean. And so we went about that by purchasing RECs, renewable energy certificates, and doing that in a way that we would, in California, focus on California solar RECs, so they were here in our backyard, and the rest of our network doing a combination of solar and wind RECs using certified third parties to help us make sure that we're certifying and retiring those credits, that we are contributing to the financial support of those renewables. That's a really big deal for us morally. It's a really big deal of us from an ESG perspective, which is in our DNA. But it's also a big deal economically, because in California, there is something called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which has a renewable pathways program. And so it's important for us as well to make sure that we're demonstrating that we're 100% renewable for that program. So it ends up being that win-win that we're looking for in terms of both the economic and the environmental impact. On a grid basis, we talk a lot to our utility partners, and EVgo is that commercial and industrial customer. We've got the meter, we're the ratepayer for the utilities that we work with. And we know that they both know that we're providing not just load growth, but beneficial load growth. What we've seen in California is that our charging curve aligns really well to help avoid curtailment of solar on the grid, because the bulk of our generation the bulk of our dispensing is between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. And so that's when you want to be helping soak up a lot of that excess solar in California. So there really is a great alignment between the EV charging load profile and the needs of the grid. And especially when we saw peak rideshare on our platform pre-COVID, what we saw was the behavior there was really well aligned with off-peak periods. Rideshare drivers drive a lot. They drive 3 to 7 times as many miles as the average retail driver. They also tend not to have access to home charging, so they do rely a great deal on public. And they want to be on the road during rush hour, which means they were driving in the mornings, charging midday off-peak during lunch, charging in the afternoon and evening, driving in the afternoon and evening, and then charging again after that last airport ride, 11 p.m., midnight, again off-peak. All of those are really good for the grid. And in working together with our partners, we continue to see the value of electrification to the whole system.
Yeah. Okay. So with the REC scenarios where will you be able to sustain that as your growth grows across the country? So could you do that in Oklahoma or Texas or Missouri as we start to see expansion in those states?
Yeah, we're not necessarily. So again, in California, we're focusing on California solar RECs. We aren't necessarily matching it one-to-one in the state beyond that, but we're doing the rest of our network outside of California. We're doing a combination of those wind and solar RECs across the country. And with the growth of renewable generation on the grid, and with our pathway for growth, we see a very sustainable path. And it's the nice fact of what's happening with decarbonization of the grid generally, right? Which is that EVs start from a base of being cleaner. As the grid cleans every year, as the grid decarbonizes every year, the load gets cleaner and cleaner, which has a natural benefit. Plus, then the continued support of RECs will push that and accelerate it further. And so it has a nice flywheel impact on the overall decarbonization of the power sector.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that the key here is going to be able to support that, especially as companies grow, because I think being a clean company and you're servicing customers who are already in that mindset, it's going to be just almost paramount to be able to put that into your marketing materials and let owners and also manufacturer partners and even retail partners understand that that's a big carbon footprint hit if someone puts something in there like that, because we're already seeing, if you think about the Elon debacle we have just on Bitcoin, people are now thinking these things of, okay, well, what other industries are causing these massive carbon loads? And they're going to start looking what's happening in retail. Oh, well, wait a minute. A Kroger just put in 15 charging banks. What are they doing? All those kinds of things will start to come into people's minds, I think. When you look at retail, I noticed you guys had deals with Kroger, Save Mart, Whole Foods, Wawa, some CBL, which is commercial property, CDR, Meijer, and then Sheetz, some more C-store applications. Is that the direction you see going, or do you feel like you're going to get a chance? Because I think the commercial and or office park or these flex parks, much like our own studio is in, we don't have a charger that's even near us, and yet we have a lot of EVs out in our parking lot. There's a lot missing there. What are your plans to kind of help that infrastructure grow?
Yeah, Paul. Well, first of all, I would say on the EVgo website, we have a suggest a charger form. So let us know if you want us to take a look at seeing if there's something nearby you that we should go after. But those retail partnerships are really important. It's a little bit of all of the above, though. We know that the growing out in and around that retail core and those partners that you referenced, the work we do with Safeway, Albertsons, Kroger, Whole Foods, all of those partners are really critical because, again, customers want to integrate that charging into their everyday life. We're seeing a lot of what we call opportunity charging, not unlike when you're near an outlet, you charge your cell phone. You may go to the grocery store and plan that around your weekly shop for your charge, or you may be going to the grocery store and the charging's there so you're topping up. At the same time, we know there's also going to be some dedicated footprints just for charging. There's also going to be that combination of workplace and other applications that folks really do want to have. And so as we hit ubiquity, which unfortunately we're a long way away from, but we're all working to accelerate, you're going to see more and more parking lots of all sorts of stripes have charging. And because EVgo is an owner and operator, the advantage of retailers working with us is that we take care of the bill, right? We're the one throat to choke for the customers. We're the ones that are on the hook for the design, the engineering, the deployment, the operations and maintenance, and everything it takes to make that work. And so there's a lot of great places for that. And retailers know that they need a reliable partner, and that's what EVgo really seeks to be.
Okay, so back to the question, are you leaning toward more retail partnerships, or are these going to be standalone deals that you guys are putting into communities? I guess what's the strategy? Is it a mix, or do you feel like there's more of a spearhead?
Yeah, I would say, again, as our focus to date has been in and around the urban core and working with those retail partners. We think that's really actually quite important for our customers because there's the existing customer base that really wants to have something to do while they're charging, right? So that concept of you go to the grocery store and you're basically, the question of how long does it take to charge, the answer is a minute, because all you do is plug in and swipe the app, and then you're going and doing something else that you were going to do anyway while the car and charger do the rest of the work. But there are some places that we've done our own footprints, and there's going to be a lot in between because there are different needs in different cities. One of the lines I use occasionally is that in the EV world, a lot of people extrapolate from a use case of one. But when you look at the data, you see patterns emerge, right? So the average session's around a half an hour, and we haven't seen that change materially despite the improvement in the vehicle's ability to charge faster and the technology that we're putting out charging faster. We're seeing people integrate that into their life, and the half an hour errand continues to be important to them. We also see that while the retail application is really important, people also like going to parks. So we've got some stations that aren't in a retail parking lot, but they're in front of where they may want to play catch or watch the kids play soccer or things like that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's talk about price, because this is one thing that starts to become an issue, I think, as people run out. For the early adopters, they start to run out of their factory deals. They're now on their own dime in terms of charging. Maybe they need to charge when they're out. Or they're, a scenario like an apartment dweller or someone like that who doesn't have access to it from overnight. With that being the case, you guys, there's two different, schools of thought. One is based on time. One is based on, how much volume. What are you finding in terms of how the market is going to land around what you're going to get charged for? Because in the old model, it's how much fuel you consume to put in your tank. In the new model with a lot of electrification platforms, it's going more so on time than anything. Where do you see that going in the future?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, Paul, because some of this is a regulatory vestige where in some markets you're not allowed to sell electricity by the kWh, so you have to price it by time. But in most of the country, the market is moving towards a kilowatt hour based model. I think this
Right.
goes back to your point before on early adopters. Especially in the
Hmm.
early days, everybody knew you had to keep it simple. Not very many Americans really know or understand what a kilowatt hour is. And so we have a lot of work to do as a whole industry to educate folks on not just kilowatt hours, but the difference between kilowatts and kilowatt hours, the concept of miles per kilowatt hour. There's a lot of that
Hmm.
education that we need to do collectively. But in the meantime, the average session for an EVgo customer is about $8.20. And what we've seen is that folks recognize that there's a value being provided for fast charging in particular. And so they recognize that there's just like it's cheaper to have a cup of coffee at home and you pay Starbucks more than you do to grind the beans at home because Starbucks has overhead with their rent, with their employees, with the ongoing operations and maintenance. So does fast charging, where you need to have the rent, you need to have the equipment itself, the ongoing networking, the telecommunications, the electricity, everything that goes with that. So there's an issue of cost, there's also an issue of value. And what we see is customers are willing to pay for that reliable, convenient charge. And that's something that the industry is obviously moving in that direction anyway, and is critical to sustainability in a long-term basis.
Yeah. Here's the thing, though, with that scenario is we as a society need to be at a much faster rate of adoption. Sure, the manufacturers are trying to get there, but the reality and the demand, I mean, if you look at Tesla, they've been kind of carrying the load for quite some time. Their demand is they're building it, selling everything they can build. So, but there is going to become a point where people are going to want to move into EVs and all these kind of scenarios. But I feel like there's going to be a little bit of a pushback from what I call the core ICE, and we won't call them enthusiasts, just the core ICE drivers that are simply going to look at this and go, wait a minute, I'm not paying for convenience at a gas station. That's not convenience, really. It's just gas. Sure, there are other things at a convenience store that I could take advantage of, but the reality is this is a service that's really required to create an infrastructure around our country to just do transportation. So I don't know if that argument, in the sense of that people are paying for convenience for fast charging, is a good one, because I feel like this is something that I feel is almost going to be a needed right. If you've replaced the entire infrastructure to electric vehicles in 20 years, I don't think speed is going to be an issue anymore. It's going to be convenience. It's just going to be it's not a convenient factor. It is. I'm going to go with a scenario that deals with it more in a practical manner, and to be able to get that last maybe 30-40% of adoption to occur, and to move the entire grid over, or I should say the entire infrastructure over from gas and petrol to electrification. We're going to need those kinds of scenarios to move that last bit of the crowd across. Sure, you might be able to get away with that with an affluent customer or someone that is an early adopter and they're willing to do these things. But once you get down into people who are really paycheck to paycheck, they're buying cheaper vehicles than the EV space. Transportation is a cost to them. It's not a feature. It's something they have to have. So I don't know. I feel like the infrastructure plan needs to be something ready for those kinds of scenarios that are coming at us from a social economic scenario. With that being said, next step is going to be taxing this, because you've got to be able to replace the petrol tax that the government has essentially feasted on for the last 25 years. How is that going to transition with charging networks?
Yeah, well, so Paul, first let's go back for a second, right? Because I think if you look at the biggest advantage to electricity as a transportation fuel is ubiquity. It's everywhere, right? Again, you can plug into the outlet at home. It'll take you a long time to get the same amount of range as you would on a level 2 or a fast charger, but it is everywhere. So you do have the biggest advantage is no matter where you are, there is fuel, and you'll be able to get that. And so the question is then,
Yeah.
what are the different types, right? So how do you get it? What's most reliable, what's most convenient, how are we working towards that? All of those things are part and parcel of hitting that 100%, hitting that 100% solution. When it comes to the gas tax, I think one of the things that's interesting is, the Congressional Budget Office put out a report. I think it was earlier this month, but it may have been last month, basically saying that around $100 annual fee on electric vehicles would make up about 1.6% of the funding gap that's needed from the gas tax. So I don't think the fees on EVs are really the solution for what's been happening for a long time, which has been underfunding the Highway Trust Fund. But there's a lot of other folks out there thinking in the policy space of what are the right mechanisms and tools to help make sure that we're investing in infrastructure. But what we know is we have to invest in infrastructure in the US to be competitive, whether that's bridges or it's broadband, whether it's charging infrastructure or it's ports. We need all of that to be competitive going forward because it's a global economy and others are investing and leading, and making sure that we have the ability to continue to accelerate is going to be critical for US growth.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we're getting a big head fake here. I'm a big EV proponent. I've been driving electric now for less than a year. I'm a big fan of it, but I just look at how it's going to affect our society over a long period of time, because you're going to have to replace the petrol taxes that are implemented in our society to handle the road and the infrastructure support and development, unless, of course, there's been a major shift in how other effects on our society, our grid system, the economic infrastructure that's in some of just the environmental impact alone from EV, that we could be seeing savings in other areas that could help subsidize that really is just a matter of a budget shift. And I think first of all, our politicians unfortunately are not smart enough to figure that out. That's a problem in itself. So I'm just wondering if we're getting pushed into a society in 20 years where we're paying exponentially more money for transportation than we ever were before, unless we get to autonomy. Autonomy is another scenario, because I think that starts to change.
Yeah, I was going to say, Paul, first of all, if we want to get into the nitty gritty of what we need to do to change the overall congressional system, we can talk about my college thesis, and we could spend all day on Buckley v. Vallejo and campaign finance reform and everything else. But I think at the core of the question is, accelerating this transition to electrification is critical for both environmental and economic security. And obviously, the savings on the budget are all over the place, right? There's the operational savings, there's the reduced maintenance costs, there's the fact that the F-150 that Ford just announced is at parity and in fact cheaper than the gasoline version. That's a huge game changer when you can hit price parity and then you get the operational savings. So some of that is part and parcel here. As we go forward, I do think autonomous is an important part of this conversation. And we've been working with some autonomous partners out there, and they recognize that fast charging is really critical to turning over and highly utilizing their assets. And so we do see that shift. And I think that's a really interesting part of this. Our colleagues at some of the rideshare companies talk about the fact that, yes, we want more people to purchase electric vehicles, but we also want more people to take electric trips. So that might be with rideshare, that might be with autonomous in particular. When we think about the movement of goods and services in particular, freight, middle mile, last mile, all of those segments are electrifying, and they're electrifying more quickly than I think anybody anticipated even 2 years ago. So the shift that's happening is society-wide, and it's why EVgo has been focused on not just the retail driver, but also fleet electrification, because all of those different parts of the economy are going to need to electrify. And especially on the heavier vehicles, the bigger the battery, the more energy it takes to go the same distance. And so that the size of the battery, the rate of charge, the use case, and the different routes these vehicles are taking, all of that will impact their charging needs. And there are a lot of solutions out there that call for experienced solution providers.
Yeah. I just want to make one correction there so our audience doesn't, because I'll probably get this in the comments. The Ford actually, it's not cheaper or even paired price-wise with the gas vehicle. The gas vehicle comes in at $29,000. Entry level for the Ford F-150, for the typical commercial truck, the $39,000 release that they did on the Lightning, same kind of scenario. It's the commercial truck, so it's still more expensive than a traditional ICE car or ICE truck in this particular case. So, but it goes back to my point that this seems to be, and you have Tesla continuing to move up their price points consistently over the past 6 months. Now, my Model Y is an extra $4,000 for the same Model Y. I know you get the Tesla over the airs, and there's a few little price or elements that have changed in terms of the molding, those kind of things. My point is that I feel like we're getting the AT&T treatment here. They start you off slow and they just change your rate a little bit every month. And before you know it, you're paying more for cable and internet than you've ever paid in your life. And it's because you've become so dependent on it. And I'm just worried that we're taking electrification of vehicles to that point. I mean, we need cheaper vehicles. So the manufacturers come in. Ford did a great job on bringing this vehicle to market. And I think that's a huge step. But they still need to do a $29,000 version of that if we're going to truly get a full ICE conversion. Then it just makes no sense because operating costs. Anyway,
and
but
the
back
two
to my
biggest
point.
advantages, the two biggest advantages to get there, right, are scale and competition. And so I think that's the two biggest shifts that we've seen, right, is the automakers have invested $300+ billion into retooling, or are investing $300+ billion into retooling. And so it's no longer the aspirational, oh, we're going to be doing it. It's the, wow, the cars are in production, the cars are for sale. Mm-hmm. It's led to a bit of an arms race, right? And so now all of a sudden, when you have that competition and you have that marker down for the $40,000 truck, it sets the next guy up to try and get lower. It sets the next guy up to beat it on spec, to beat it on cost. And I think that really does help push this whole market forward. If you look at why California has so many more of the electric vehicles in the US than the rest of the country, yes, some of it is the general policy and environmental friendliness of California. But one of the most specific reasons is that the zero emissions vehicles mandate made more availability a reality. There are more models of electric vehicles for sale in California than any other state in the US. So as a result, there was always more consumer choice. Having more electric vehicle models across the segments, across geographies, is really helpful to consumers, not just because they can get, hey, I'm much more of a Kia Niro guy than I am an i3 guy, or vice versa. That's really important, but so is the fact that then there's pressure to make sure that you're putting the best vehicles out there at competitive prices, and that's good for consumers as well.
Yeah, I worry about the consumer in the sense that we're getting the bait and switch, and that's what worries me the most right now, because you do have a complete head shift occurring at the ICE manufacturers right now. They have to. I mean, this is not. It's now table stakes. It's no longer an if. It's just a when. So I get that, but at the same time, I hope that we can maintain infrastructure and price controls to make this something that's available for entire society, as opposed to just the affluent consumers of our society who get, to live in these little green communities all over California, and it looks so beautiful and everything. But in reality, West Texas needs this too, as well. So I just look at those kind of scenarios, and I hope that both manufacturers, companies like yourselves, and others are really trying to look at more of a societal shift as opposed to where the dollar is going. One question on...
We recognize that there's absolutely an environmental justice element to this. Sorry, I'll let you get back to the next question. But I think it is important, right? We talk a lot about electric for all and what does that mean? And partially it's enabling access to electric vehicles for those people in apartments without access to charging at home. But it's also about being in different geographies. And we talk a lot about the legacy in the United States of redlining in certain communities. So we take a very proactive lens of how are we doing in enabling access to EVs for disproportionately impacted communities by air pollution burden, by other demographics. And so, we put out the first fast chargers in Compton and Inglewood, and we've worked really closely to put things on the south side of Atlanta and to work in different geographies. And it's not always about necessarily a particular demographic as it is about coverage and equity and thinking about how we're going to push that envelope. And then how do we work with partners? How are we working with groups like Grid Alternatives to enable access for lower income individuals that want to purchase and operate vehicles? How do we think about that partnership ecosystem? Right? This is still a new industry. And so in order to make sure that we're hitting that sustainability of the business model, some of it's going to require partnership to work early, as well as a lot of learning and iteration. Right? There's going to be fast lessons and things that we all shift. 8 years ago, 50 kilowatts was the fastest thing. And so that's what we were putting out everywhere. Now we're putting out shared 350 kilowatt chargers. We're putting out a number of different technology configurations because the needs of the market evolve. This week we announced our reservations pilot because we heard from some folks that they wanted to have that confidence that if they knew ahead of time they were going to be dropping off the kids at soccer practice, that's when they wanted to charge. So what are the things that we need to do to meet the needs of the market? That's going to be technology-based, that's going to be economically, that's going to be demographically, and that's going to be on geographic coverage.
Couple of last questions here. I would agree with that, definitely, in the growth of that. One side point, though, is that we do have 25 years of analysis and data already at us currently. So the infrastructure that we've built over the last 25 years, we know every place where it's broken. We know every place where it's underserved and overserved. So I would think that the roadmap is somewhat ready, today, especially with our computing power, ability to apply just machine learning and some simple forms of AI to really start to study use case scenarios, adoption rate, rollout rate, all of the data coming from what kind of vehicle saturation points we're getting in certain communities. I just want to make sure that we understand we have all this data. It's already here, so there shouldn't be any mistakes. I just feel like if we're making mistakes now, that's just because somebody's not paying attention. So I hope that that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I would say, well, the biggest shift is consumer behavior, right? So we at EVgo, we've developed a tool
Is
that
it
we call
really?
EVgo for some of our network planning, where we're
Do you
using
think consumer do you think that's really a big shift?
Well, the reason I'm saying it is that we use a tool we call Amerigo that we developed internally. It's a proprietary machine learning tool using regression analysis, our own data set, demographic, weather, other traffic pattern variables. But the biggest shift is people drive very differently with a 250-mile range car than they do a 120-mile range car. So the data set from the early days is skewed
Sure.
very much towards an affluent community using it as a second vehicle that has a different use pattern than the drivers that are using it as their sole vehicle. And I think that consumer behavior does shift a lot of the planning. And so you're right, we do have to be using the data. We have a great data set from operating our network as long as we have, and we continue to iterate on it because that learning and that technology advantage we have is really critical to our network planning. But some of it is also making sure we're constantly in dialogue with our customers and hearing. We just announced earlier this year we hit our 250,000 customer milestone. We're really proud of that at EVgo, and we try and listen to them because we know that their needs are changing. So yes, we have a lot of data, but we also know that what's happening is a shift in how they're using their vehicles.
Interesting. And it's starting to show, I think, on the network too, because I just here in Florida, we're seeing that kind of pockets of just the network itself where it's available. You kind of I could tell you without even looking at a map where it's most likely going to be available. So it's going to be interesting to see how this rolls out. A couple of last questions for you in terms of retail and C-store rollouts. How fast do you think we're going to see convenience store companies shift from, or at least have some variable of charging stations along with gas stations? Is that a potential, or do you think we're going to see a completely new retail map as to where charging is going to occur?
Yeah, so Paul, I think it's going to be a little bit of everything again. You mentioned earlier that EVgo has been working with Wawa and Sheetz. We've also been working with Chevron with a number of partnerships out in California where Chevron is the site host. EVgo continues to own and operate the chargers, and they're learning from us, and we're having access to great locations. And that's the symbiosis of the business model generally. In the future, we're going to see this mix on highways. Those retails, those gas stations and C-stores will continue to be extremely important. In the urban and suburban core, we're going to have to see what customers want the most. But our hunch is that you're really going to be moving towards much more of the retail, much more of a larger footprint station as well. But the gas stations and C-stores are very interested. Some of them recognize it as a hedge. Some of them recognize it as a critical revenue opportunity and as the fact of inevitability that the whole market is decarbonizing.
Yeah. Well, I could just see a Wawa because of the function they have. They really are more of a retailer than they are a gas station. Gas station is just a side market. But I could see those gas stations in 10 years completely leveled and having a parking lot full of chargers with access to all the convenience services that they offer, which would be, I think, would be a good option to hang out there and, get my beef jerky and watch a little Netflix, hang out. That'd be okay. I think the kids would like it anyway. Last question is, when you look at businesses, are you guys doing anything to help businesses start to implement this for their employees, their particular facilities? I mean, like our studios alone, that would be perfect out here. But we've even talked about maybe dropping a charging station just for the Teslas that can, get you that NEMA 1450 out of the back of our studios because there's nothing here. But any kind of plans going in that for commercial property?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more interest from even some of the site hosts that we partner with for the fast charging for the public. we're hearing from them
Yeah.
now they're more interested in some level 2 for their employee base, right? And so
Right.
I think, the EVgo philosophy is match throughput to use case. If you know there's an application where folks are going to be there for 8 hours, that's
Hmm.
likely a level 2 application. If you know that
Right.
they're only going to be there for 15 to 45 minutes, that's for sure a DC fast charging application. And if you know they're going to be there for a long time, I think sometimes about airport lots, sometimes trickle charging is fine. The other part of the
Yeah.
commercial application that's interesting, though, are the opportunities for multiple applications, right? So, is there a building where there's not just the visitors, there's not just the employees, but there's a fleet that's operating as well? And therefore, you can
Hmm.
match up and have usage of a level 2 overnight on the fleet side that's being used during the day by visitors or employees. I think there's a bunch of those solutions that we're working with partners on as they all try and figure out what's exactly right for them. At EVgo, we try and have flexible business models and flexible solutions for different partners. We've heard from our fleet partners in particular that what they like about working with us is we provide access to a public fast charging network, we can provide behind the fence solutions, and we can provide dedicated out in the wild solutions on property they don't own, which means there's hub and spoke opportunities.
Right.
Same thing with the level 2s where we can do a charging as a service model or other different models where it works really well for the different needs of various customers.
Yeah, very cool. Listen, I love what you guys are doing. I think we need more companies like yourself kind of setting the tone out there to get it moving in the right direction aggressively, because I think that's the thing we don't want to do now, because if we get caught flat-footed with one, the ICE manufacturers really aggressively rolling out models. I mean, to me, the Ford drop alone should have sent shockwaves through the industry in terms of where the demand is going to be going very quickly for the electrification adoption. So kudos to everything you guys are doing at EVgo. Thank you so much for stopping in on the show today, Jonathan.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Excellent. All right, you guys are listening in over at the podcast right now. Make sure and hit the stars if you're over on iTunes. That's how we get good feedback from you. You can also leave a rating over there. And of course, if you're here on YouTube, make sure and subscribe. This is the number one way you can help the network and the show. Tell your friends about this, because this is something that I think as we move, and I know from just the comments, as we move to a more technological future, the importance of these kinds of things is going to become more and more mainstream. And maybe you become the early adopter or the person in your own network or neighborhood that really starts to understand these things. Share the video out there. And make sure, if you have an idea for a show, send us that idea to producer@revernetworks.com. You can always hit me up on Twitter @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.